Questions. We now move on to the Attorney-General questions. Sorry. Hold on, Stephen. Look after yourself. Take care. Right, we start with Attorney-General questions. We're Hobhouse.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Attorney-General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I will answer questions 1 and 10 together. Tackling violence against women and girls is a priority area for government. Recently, I visited CPS Thames and Chiltern to hear specifically about the work that they're doing to combat stalking. I also heard how the Domestic Abuse Joint Justice Plan will transform how we investigate this all too frequent crime.
We're Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Data from the Crown Prosecution Service shows that despite an increase in the number of referrals from the police for domestic abuse, both charging rates and prosecutions have decreased in the last quarter. In Bath, the Southside Project, Voices in Somerset and Avon Rape and Sexual Abuse Support all support those affected by domestic abuse and sexual violence, but we cannot rely on charities to do the heavy lifting. Does the Minister agree that if we want the public to have confidence in the system, the increased number in reporting should lead to increased numbers of prosecutions?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, it's of course always very difficult to talk with pleasure about increased numbers of prosecutions because all of the survivors of those acts have gone through a horrible event in order for the prosecution to take place. But I agree with the Honourable Lady that generally it is a good sign that prosecution numbers are going up, as they are in her area. I'm pleased to say with adult rape cases. With domestic abuse cases, there is more to do, which is why we're focusing specifically on the Domestic Abuse Joint Justice Plan. And I know that the work of the charities in her region, funded by government, I should say, but independent, which is what survivors prefer, will really help us to make sure that those survivors get justice.
Chris Elmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Attorney-General will know that the Online Safety Act was given King consent at the beginning of this year. She'll be aware within that Act there are various bits of legislation to protect women and girls in relation to cyber flashing, deep fakes and revenge porn. I wonder if you could set out to the House how many prosecutions have taken place under this new important piece of legislation that drives forward trying to protect more women and girls from these other forms of violence.
Attorney-General.
I'm afraid I don't have to hand those figures specifically for his constituency or under that specific Act, but I'm very happy to get those for him. We are confident that this will be an Act that it is possible to bring prosecutions under. These are important, very distressing, but relatively new crimes, and it is important that we continue to work together with the police and CPS in prosecuting novel areas of criminal activity. These are really difficult for the survivors of these crimes to deal with.
Chair of the Select Committee, Sir Robert Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Attorney-General rightly refers to the work that is done in relation to domestic violence. But, of course, the most serious offences of violence against women and girls are rape and serious sexual offences. And there is a concern, as she will know, that there are delays once victims have come forward in their cases being heard, and that's largely because of the difficulty in getting suitably experienced barristers to prosecute these cases. Does she accept that one of the main drivers of that is the fact that since legal aid fees were increased for defence barristers, the prosecution fees have lagged behind, and there's about a £500 gap on the brief fee between prosecuting and defending. Would she agree it's urgent that we plug that gap so that we get suitable counsel prosecuting as well as defending those cases?
The chairman of the Select Committee is tempting me to step on the territory very firmly of the Lord Chancellor, as he well knows. But he will also know, because he and I have discussed this many times, that the Lord Chancellor and I speak several times a week about our concerns about the shortage of counsel in the criminal sphere in particular. I would say to him gently, though, that I don't think money is the only reason why it is not always attractive to prosecute Rasso case after Rasso case. these are draining cases to be involved in. They are listed very tightly at the moment because of the pandemic backlogs, as he says, and this leads to tensions with listing, tensions with the judiciary, and it can make it very difficult to do this area of work relentlessly, and I have nothing but praise for the barristers who are engaged with it.
Mary Roberts.
Question 3, Mr Speaker.
Attorney, Minister.
Yes.
Who is it? Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So close and collaborative working across the criminal justice system is key to securing justice for victims, holding offenders to account and keeping the public safe. The police and CPS invested heavily in new ways of working, including through the national operating model for rape prosecutions, meaning the police and CPS working more closely together at an earlier stage in prosecutions.
Mary Robbins.
During a recent visit to JMP's divisional headquarters in Stockport, I heard that there can be significant delays between sending a case to the CPS and receiving a charging decision back. To solve this, it was suggested that having CPS staff based inside the station would speed up the process and improve communications. What consideration has my honourable friend given to a CPS presence within police stations, and would he work with me and Stockport Division to facilitate a trial?
I thank my honourable friend for raising this extremely pertinent point. She's absolutely right to emphasise the importance of cooperation at an early stage between the police and CPS. And in fact, at a recent visit last month to the Charing Cross police station, I was considering precisely this point. There they have a buddy system with CPS lawyers working with police officers, which is improving case file quality. We're actively exploring how we can ensure closer early working with the CPS and the police at this very moment, and I will certainly look at Stockport personally with her.
Dorrans.
Speaker, good morning. Mr Speaker, the United Kingdom Government is going above and beyond to ensure British arms are readily available in Israel's arsenal to bomb Gaza. The Attorney-General refuses to give out legal advice based upon the long-standing Law Officers' Convention. Yet circumstances are now between life and death for up to 1.6 million people. What steps is she taking to ensure Britain is not complicit in the destruction of a nation and its people?
Yeah. Mr Speaker, I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his question. I can assure him that the Attorney-General will keep all of these matters under close review, will ensure that any legal advice is, of course, properly obtained and acted upon.
Right, Sharon Hodgson.
Number 4, Mr Speaker.
Just with Karen.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm so sorry, the questions were renumbered at a late stage and I think we're all finding it tricky. The Royal Albert Hall is one of our most important cultural institutions. I know that there are long-standing differences between the trustees of the Hall and the charity commissioners over governance matters. I really hope that the parties will work together to resolve their differences without expensive litigation, and I stand absolutely ready to facilitate those discussions.
Sean.
I'm very grateful, and given that the Attorney-General, in her, I must say, excellent recent letter on the matter, has already expressed her disappointment. This is a quote, disappointment that the Royal Albert Hall Bill is not more ambitious, and that, again a quote, the Constitution of the Corporation of the Hall of Arts and Sciences gives rise to a potential conflict between the private interests of seat-holding trustees and the corporation's charitable objects, end quote. I totally agree. And so please, I know she said she will look at this issue, but unlike her predecessors, will she also consider, if she needs to, referring the matter to the charity tribunal so it can be settled once and for all? Because tickets to attend one of our country's most famous and treasured venues should not be turning up on notorious ticketing websites like Viagogo, and those who are receiving those ill-gotten gains should not be running the charity.
Minister.
I know that the Honourable Lady takes a very close interest in these matters, and I believe is the chair of the APPG on ticket sales, and I really commend her for her work in this important area. I think many of us who are great supporters of the Albert Hall are concerned by the costs of the tickets. I am hopeful, as I said earlier, that the two parties can continue to work together. I want to avoid expensive litigation, if that can be done. I know that a previous Attorney-General was asked permission to refer the matter to the first-tier tribunal. I have not been asked by the Charity Commission to do so, and I am very hopeful that this matter can be resolved amicably, and I am very happy to remain involved if that is helpful.
Andrew Jones.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Question 5.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The CPS takes the issue of keeping women and children safe online extremely seriously. I am pleased to report that the CPS has delivered the first conviction for cyber flashing within weeks of the new offence becoming law. This is an important milestone for protecting women and girls online and demonstrates how this government has worked to put perpetrators behind bars.
Andrew Jones.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for that answer? In addition to the good work that he's doing helping to prevent online bullying, trolling and abuse, keeping safe online includes helping to prevent fraud. So can he detail how the government, through the online fraud charter, is ensuring tech companies are helping women and children?
Well, my honourable friend's quite right to draw attention to the online fraud charter, which is a world first. It's something that's sitting underneath the Online Safety Act, and this is 12 of the biggest tech companies that are working together to reduce fraud on their platforms. The signatories are agreeing to undertake certain measures within 6 months. These are things like blocking, reporting and takedowns to ensure that the vulnerable are protected online, for example, Mr. Speaker, such as children from being exploited as money mules.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Visit.
Thank you very much again, Mr. Speaker. Whilst non-threatening peaceful protest is fundamental, these rights are not absolute and they must be balanced with the rights and freedom of others. The CPS works closely with the police to ensure that those who commit offences during protests are brought to justice and our streets are kept safe. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, just last month, the Crown Prosecution Service successfully prosecuted a protester under the Terrorism Act 2000 after he wore a Hamas headband to a pro-Palestine rally.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister rightly points out there's clearly a balance between democratic, peaceful protests and the tactics used by the likes of Just Stop Oil to disrupt society. Now, we've seen mass protests, mostly peaceful, on the London streets, but we did see damage to the likes of the Ministry of Defence, which is completely unacceptable. How do these new laws that we've passed in Parliament aid prosecutions for those not interested in peaceful protest?
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this extremely pertinent and concerning point. In fact, the police already have a full suite of powers, such as under the Public Order Act 1986, Section 4A, for example, under criminal damage, which is the offence that he referred to earlier, to ensure that they act. Government has, however, reinforced those powers under the 2023 Public Order Act, and the CPS is working closely with the police, doing things like providing round-the-clock charging advice nationally. He's absolutely right. It is unacceptable that those who are taking part in legitimate democratic process either commit criminal damage. Mr. Speaker, it is also utterly unacceptable that, for example, Jewish people feel threatened and that the government expects the full powers available to the police to be used in order to prosecute offenders.
Briglin.
Number 7, Mr. Speaker.
Attorney-General.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'll answer questions 7 and 8 together. As everybody across the House is aware, the Law Officers Convention means I can't disclose outside government whether or not I've provided advice or the specifics of that advice. But it is no secret that we continue to call for international humanitarian law to be respected and civilians to be protected.
Mary Glendon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's more than 3 months since the ICJ issued its interim ruling on the Gaza conflict and set out steps Israel must take in order to protect civilian life. The Netanyahu government failed to comply with that ruling as yet, but our government still hasn't come out publicly and urged it to do so. So will the Attorney-General take the opportunity today to call on Israel to take steps ordered by that court?
Attorney-General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, this government very firmly respects and the role and the independence of the ICJ, and the court's ruling, the court's order, called for the immediate release of the hostages and the need to get more aid into Gaza, and that is exactly what this government is also calling for.
Abrahams.
Mr. Speaker, but the ICJ ruling also declared that there was a plausible genocide. And as I said at the UQ to the Deputy Foreign Secretary on Tuesday, citing the UN international law that relates to that, where there are concerns that a potential genocide is happening, that are the circumstances to withdraw the sales of arms. So can the Attorney-General tell me and my constituents, because this is a massive issue for thousands of people across the country, exactly when the government will come out recognising both international law and our risks in breaching it?
Attorney-General.
This government believes very firmly in international law. The Foreign Secretary announced on the 9th of April that our position on export licences is unchanged. We publish data on our export licensing decisions transparently and on a quarterly basis.
Attorney-General Emily Thornbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've heard questions about the International Court of Justice. I would like to ask questions about the International Criminal Court. The ICC Chief Prosecutor said last week that all attempts to impede, intimidate or improperly influence the court over its investigations into war crimes in Gaza must cease immediately. He was forced to issue that demand after a letter signed by 12 US senators warned the ICC, and I quote, "Target Israel and we will target you," threatening sanctions not just against the ICC officials, but their employees, associates and families. Will the Attorney-General join me in condemning those Republican senators for their outrageous actions? And will she also join the ICC's Chief Prosecutor in agreeing that anyone who threatens the court simply for doing its job is undermining its very impartiality and independence on which the court's international mandate depends?
I thought the ICC statement was worthy of note, and I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for bringing it to the House's attention. The independent prosecutor was also keen to point out in that statement that he welcomed active engagement by governments and other parties on the work that he is clearly engaged in around the world to make sure that international humanitarian law is respected and that war crimes are not committed. He is a British prosecutor, and we in this government are proud to work with him. We've been very proud to support him in his work in Ukraine, for example. There are ongoing investigations into what is going on in Israel and Gaza by more than one international court at the moment, and I think it's difficult to speculate on specific outcomes.
We now come to SNP spokesperson Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Attorney-General will be aware of the Government's grounds of defence in the ongoing case of Al-Haq versus the Secretary of State for Business and Trade, in which the FCDO lawyers admitted, and I quote, "The inability to come to a clear assessment on Israel's record of compliance with international humanitarian law poses significant policy risks." What's her assessment of that submission? And given that the FCDO's concerns about Israel's compliance with IHL, what has she said to her Cabinet colleagues who are worried that the issuing of arms export licences could make the UK Government complicit in breaches of international humanitarian law and the Arms Trade Treaty?
Attorney-General.
Well, I can't give, as the Honourable Gentleman knows, I think, my specific legal advice. I can't share that with the House. That's for the Government alone. But I can say that the Foreign Secretary has reviewed the most recent advice from the IHL cell, and that has informed his decision that there isn't a clear risk that the items exported from the UK might be used to commit or to facilitate a serious violation of IHL. That leaves our position on export licences unchanged, but that position is kept under review.
Christine John.
Question number 9, please.
Finished.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, the government published a new fraud strategy to combat fraud and economic crime, and the Corporate Transparency Act received royal assent. Last month, the SFO published its strategy for the next 5 years, focused on tech, intelligence gathering and enforcement. In fact, I'm pleased to report to the House that on Friday, the SFO secured the conviction of former investment manager David Kennedy for his part in a £100 million investment fraud in which hundreds of people lost their savings.
Christine Jolly.
Thank you very much. Fraud is prevalent. In fact, it accounts for, I think, a third of all crimes committed in this country. And increasingly, we're seeing online scams. Often, vulnerable people get caught up in these phishing schemes. So, has the government considered, and will the government consider, an online crimes agency to clamp down specifically on online crimes like this, which will become more prevalent with the use of artificial intelligence?
Minister.
Honourable Member is absolutely right. This is a particularly pernicious crime. It often targets the vulnerable, and it is something that is, sadly, with an interconnected and digital world, something that is likely to increase. We will look very closely at all such matters. There's a number of joint strategies that take place between agencies in any event, but I'm certainly very happy to look at the suggestion she makes.
Mr. Coulter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There were 36 failed pandemic PPE contracts costing over £1 billion, but only one company, PP MedPro, has been named. So if the government is serious about tackling fraud, why is it refusing to disclose the details of those other companies, and how exactly was those contracts awarded? And can the attorney update the House on how many prosecutions are pending?
So the Honourable Member quite rightly raises a matter of particular concern to him and indeed to the whole House. HMRC remains committed to COVID-19 scheme compliance and will continue to prioritise the most serious cases of abuse. Specifically on prevention and recoveries, up to the 30th of September 2023, HMRC have prevented the payment or recovered the overpayment of over £1.6 billion worth of grants, made up of £430 million prevented being paid out and over £1.2 billion recovered from overpayments. On the 30th of September 2023, HMRC had opened 51 criminal investigations into suspected fraud within the schemes and made a total of 80 arrests.